Hello, Life Group leaders, and welcome to week 5 of We Believe. This week we're talking about the gospel, the good news. I know as you've done your reading, you've learned a big new word called euangelion, which is the Greek word for good news, so you can impress your friends with that big, exciting word. But when we think about the good news, we're here to coming to a context where both good and news are kind of not as clear as they once used to be. So first of all, just from where your people in your group may be coming from, these days, news is bad. Some people, myself, I don't even like to watch the news because one, is it believable? And it's usually bad news. So thinking of anything being good news is, first of all, countercultural and almost in a new believer's eyes, like, is that really possible that news could be good? And then we're also coming to a point where good is really subjective and not good in terms of morality being good. It's how many likes do I have? How popular am I? Am I following the right influencers? So culturally, depending on where your group age and stage of life is, just even thinking of the gospel as good news might automatically set up some skepticism or some step back, hey, what are we talking about here? So that's where we find ourselves. But what we want to remember is the good news of the gospel. It is good news, and it is amazing news because it is, as it says as Romans 1:16 will end in this place too. It is the power of God for those who believe. And it's good news to us because it's keeping us from what we deserve to have. So we aren't starting of a place of we're doing good or even that the world is good. We are in need of something, and this gospel, this good news, what it offers to us is something we desperately need. So culturally, that's kind of the setting we find ourselves in when we want to talk about the gospel and what it is. Pitfalls for talking about this particular chapter are going to come mainly, I think, from a culture of gospel and. You might remember that Pastor Ross talked about it in his section on Jesus, chapter 3, that it isn't Jesus and something else. I'm a math person. I loved when he used the equation of Jesus plus nothing is everything, and we can say that same thing about the gospel. So a pitfall will be if someone thinks that there's something to add on to the good news that Jesus had. He shared what he shared. He lived the life that we couldn't live, died the death in place of us to have the life in eternity that we don't even deserve. That is the good news. But many times we add an and to that. It is an and go to church. It is an and make sure you post enough times about your particular candidate. So make sure anytime we're talking about the good news that it is standalone. We don't add anything else to it. It is faith versus works. It is good news, not good advice. There's an amazing section on that you've probably already read. Also, things to be aware of is avoid overemphasis on either the temporal, the here and now in this lifetime benefits of the gospel, or just simply emphasizing that it's your get out of hell free card. Many of you might have gotten saved in an era. If you died tonight, where will you go? And your motivation for responding to the good news was to be able to spend eternity in heaven, and that is all true. But just let's keep those in balance because there is benefits of the gospel, both here and now and in the future. So avoid an overemphasis on either of those because it is both and. Common questions you might get, it's hard to believe that it is only by faith that we receive the gospel. Is the good news really that good? Again, kicking it back to the skepticism currently in our culture. Yes, it is only by faith that we are saved. Yes, it is only by faith that we accept that good news. And then we might get questions of, well, how do I actually share it? Because if you've received it and if you accept the doctrine as it's stated, well, then we might be, first of all, I think that should prompt us to share it with others. And so I think a great way to share the gospel is memorizing the chapter in section 1 on page 43. I know even for me, having gone through seminary, kind of complicated my ability to share the gospel because now I have all these big other words. But even before that, how do you simply and succinctly explain the good news? And I do encourage you to memorize that chapter. Maybe your group would want to do that as an accountability project. But that section there, section 143, is an amazing way to articulate the gospel very succinctly in a way that's understandable. How do we handle the difficult parts of the gospel? And not that it's difficult because it is good news, but difficulty spots could be the tension between salvation and what we call sanctification. That's, we get our salvation through the good news, but what happens as we walk it out in life? So again, it's not a gospel and. So salvation is both an event and a process. So the good news brings the event of salvation, but sanctification, that we'll cover in chapter 11, that process of working out the changes in your life, the behavioral things that it does bring us, not required for salvation, not required by the gospel, but that might be a tension point of just seeing how the faith and works together. I love going to Philippians 2:12 and 13, and it goes like this: "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." So we see that there is salvation in the good news. We are to work it out. That's what that verse tells us. But it is God who works in us for that. So every time the gospel still is going to come back to Jesus, his death on the cross, and what God offers us. And then finally, boundaries outside of orthodoxy. What is outside the good news, the evangelion that we're studying this week? Number one, moralism, which is touched on page 43. We are not acceptable because of what we do. We can't do enough things to put the scales in our right direction. So we want to avoid just feeling like, well, I'm a good person, so do I really need the good news? Or that's how I earn the good news, by being a good person. So that's called moralism. That's out of bounds. And then also knowledge without faith, meaning that no matter what, we might acknowledge that there's a God. We might acknowledge Jesus was a historical figure, but just the knowledge of the truth of the gospel is not enough. We must also believe in our heart and confess with our mouth, as it says in Romans. It is not just knowledge of the good news, it's faith in that good news that is where salvation lies. If you have any questions, don't forget to use the link on the Life Group tab on your app. And I'd like to close with this because this just gets me fired up when I think about the gospel. Romans 1:17 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes." That is what we are talking about this week. So get excited. Do not be ashamed of this gospel. It is the power of God for salvation for you and for everyone who believes. So I encourage you to even find someone to share the gospel with this week. Take care.